Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Quote of the day: Life is not about finding yourself. Life is about creating yourself. Today, the topic of my presentation is types of hypothesis, p-value, alpha and beta error, power of study. And I'm presenting it under supervision of my professor, Dr. Sair Afzal. Now, what is p-value? It is defined as the probability of obtaining a result equal to or more extreme than what was actually observed. It was first introduced by Carl Pearson in his Pearson's chi-square test. It can be seen in relation to the probability of making a type 1 error, which we'll discuss ahead. So here we can see that this is the p-value, which is a shaded green area, and it is the probability of an observed or more extreme result arising by chance. So the vertical coordinate is the probability density of each outcome computed under the null hypothesis. And again, p-value is the area under the curve past the observed data point. Now, arbitrarily cut off 0.05, that is 5% chance of false positive conclusion. If P is less than 0.05 statistically significant, then null hypothesis should be rejected and alternate hypothesis should be accepted. And if P is greater than 0.05 statistically not significant, then accept null hypothesis and reject alternative hypothesis. Testing potential harmful interventions, alpha value is set below 0.05. So it depends upon the research question. P-value degrees of magnitude, very small. The results are said to be highly significant. If it's near 0.05, it is said to be borderline significant. And if it is near 1, result does not matter. So this is how p-value is calculated. That depending upon the statistic we are interested in, predetermined p-values and the critical values are displayed in this statistical table. So each type of distribution has its own table. It is also possible to calculate exact p-values with computers instead of using such tables. Now, interpretation. If the results are statistically significant, decide whether the observed differences are clinically important. If not significant, see if the sample size are adequate enough not to have missed a clinically important difference. Power of study, which we will discuss ahead. It tells us the strength, which we can conclude that there is no difference between two groups. Again, statistical significance does not necessarily mean real significance. If sample size is large, even small differences can have a low p-value. Lack of significance does not necessarily mean null hypothesis true. If sample size is small, there could be a real difference, but we are not able to detect. So if you perform a large number of tests in a study, 1 in 20 will be significant merely by chance. Now, type 1 error and type 2 errors, also known as alpha and beta errors, respectively. So type 1 error, it is the error when we reject the null hypothesis when it is true. And type 2 error is that it is the probability of accepting or not rejecting the null hypothesis when it is false. So type 1 error, the chance or probability that you will reject a null hypothesis that should not have been rejected. And type 2 error, there is a chance or probability that you will not reject the null hypothesis, that is, you will accept it when it should have been rejected. Type 1 error, this will result in you deciding two groups are different or two variables are related when they really are not. Type 2, this will result in you deciding two groups are not different or two variables are not related when they really are. So the probability of a type 1 error is also called as alpha, and the probability of type 2 error is called beta. These are the example. Here we can see that this is a null hypothesis that person is not guilty of the crime. So type 1 error is that person is judged as guilty when the person actually did not commit the crime, that is convicting an innocent person. And type 2 error is that person is judged not guilty when they actually did commit the crime. This is another example that null hypothesis. Medicine A cures disease B. Type 1 error as null hypothesis true but rejected as false. So medicine A cures disease but is rejected as false. Type 2 error that medicine A does not cure disease B but is accepted as true. Power of the study. It is the ability to detect a statistically significant association. It can also be seen as a probability of not missing an effect due to sampling error where there is really an effect. It is also the probability of avoiding a type 2 error, and it is denoted as 1 minus beta. A prospective power analysis is used before collecting data to consider design sensitivity. A retrospective power analysis is used in order to know whether the studies you are interpreting were well enough designed. Factors affecting power. As sample size increases, power increases. As population variance decrease, power increases. As the difference increases, power increases. Statistical power is greater for one-tailed test. The probability of making a type 1 error, the greater the power. So these are the factors upon which power depends: sample size, effect size, p level. Now, what does 80% power mean? Power is usually set at 80%. This means that if there are two effects to be found in 100 different studies with 80% power, only 80 out of 100 statistical tests will actually detect them. If we don't ensure sufficient power, a study may not be able to detect a true effect at all. Now, coming to hypothesis, types of hypothesis. Now, what is hypothesis? It is considered as an intelligent guess or prediction that gives direction to the researcher to answer the research question. Or it is defined as the formal statement of the tentative expected prediction explanation of the relationship between two or more variables in a specified population. A hypothesis is a formal tentative statement of the expected relationship between two or more variables under study. It helps to translate the research problem and objective into a clear explanation and prediction of the expected results or outcomes of the study. Contributions of hypothesis. It provides clarity to the research problem and research objectives. It describes, explains, or predicts the expected results or outcome of the research. It indicates the type of research design. It directs the research study process. It identifies the population of research study that is to be investigated or examined. It facilitates data collection, data analysis, and data interpretation. Function. It enables an investigator to start his research work, may lead to formulations of another hypothesis, leads to interpret results, drawing conclusions related to original purpose. Characteristics. The hypothesis must be capable of verification. It must be related to the existing body of knowledge. A hypothesis needs to be precise, simple, and specific. Now, these are the multiple types of hypothesis: simple, complex, empirical, null, alternative, directional, non-directional, logical, statistical, causal, associative. We will discuss each one by one. First comes simple hypothesis. It is that one in which there exists relationship between two variables. One is called independent variable or cause, and the other is dependent variable or effect. For example, smoking leads to cancer. The higher ratio of unemployment leads to crime. So it's just a simple hypothesis. Complex hypothesis. It is that one in which a relationship among variables exists. In this type, dependent and independent variables are more than two. For example, smoking and other drugs leads to cancer, tension, chest infections. The higher ratio of unemployment, poverty, illiteracy leads to crimes like dacoity, etc. Then comes empirical hypothesis. It means that it is based on evidence. In scientific word, the word empirical refers to the use of working hypothesis that can be tested using observation experiment. So empirical data is produced by experiment and observation. Question form of hypothesis. It is the simplest form of empirical hypothesis. In simple case of investigation, research are adequately implemented by resuming a question. For example, how is the ability of 9th class students in learning moral values? Null hypothesis. It is formulated against the working hypothesis, opposes the statement of the working hypothesis, as working hypothesis is another name for alternative hypothesis. So it is contrary to the positive statement made in the working hypothesis, formulated to disprove the contrary of a working hypothesis. When a researcher rejects a null hypothesis, he actually proves a working hypothesis. Instead, to mean a null hypothesis, H naught is used. For example, H naught is 0, that is null hypothesis, where Q is the property of the population under investigation. Alternate hypothesis. It is formulated when a researcher totally rejects null hypothesis. So he develops such a hypothesis with adequate reasons. The notion used to mean alternate hypothesis is mentioned as here. Examples, working hypothesis, like population influences the number of bank branches in a town. Null hypothesis is that population do not have any influence on the number of bank branches in a town. However, alternate hypothesis that population has significant effect on the number of bank branches in a town. A researcher formulates this hypothesis only after rejecting the null hypothesis. Statistical hypothesis. It is a hypothesis which can be verified statistically. The statement would be logical or illogical, but if statistic verifies it, it will be statistical hypothesis. Then alternative hypotheses are further divided into two types, directional and non-directional. Directional hypothesis, it predicts the direction of the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. For example, high quality of nursing education will lead to high quality of nursing practice skills. Girls' ability of learning moral science is better than boys. So it is indicating some direction. Non-directional hypothesis, it predicts the relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable, but does not specify the direction of the relationship. For example, teacher-student relationship influence students' learning. So it is not indicating that how more or less. Uh, so there is no significant difference. Another example is that there is no significant difference between ninth class boys and girls' abilities of learning moral values. So we can see this is the graph showing the difference between directional hypothesis versus non-directional hypothesis. Directional hypothesis is also known as one-tailed hypothesis, and non-directional hypothesis is also known as two-tailed hypothesis. Then comes causal hypothesis. It predicts a cause and effects relationship or interaction between the independent variable and dependent variable. This hypothesis predicts the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable. For example, this is the question that does marriage cause balance among women? So causation hypothesis related to this question is that marriage causes stress which leads to hair loss. So it is showing the causal hypothesis. Another question is what is the relationship between recreational drugs and psychosis? So causation hypothesis related to this question is that recreational drugs cause psychosis. Then comes associative hypothesis. It predicts an associative relationship between the independent variable and a dependent variable. That is, when there is a change in any of the variables, changes also occur in other variable. Example, sick people in hospital. You could conduct a study hypothesizing that hospitals have more sick people in them than other institutions in society. However, we don't hypothesize that the hospitals cause the sickness. And the last is that there's another new type of hypothesis which I found that exact versus inexact hypothesis. For brevity's sake, this as written by the author that I have paired these two hypotheses into the one point. The reality is that we have already seen both of these types of hypotheses at play already. An exact hypothesis, also known as point hypothesis, specifies a specific prediction, whereas an exact hypothesis assumes a range of possible values without giving an exact outcome. So he argues that an exact hypothesis specifies the exact values of the parameters of interest, whereas an inexact hypothesis specifies a range of possible values for the parameters of interest. So generally, a null hypothesis is an exact hypothesis, whereas alternative, composite, directional, or non-directional hypotheses are all inexact. So coming on to MCQs. MCQ number 1. Introducing fluoride to the water system in the city of Austin decreases the number of dental visits per capita per year. This is an example of dash type of hypothesis. Unidirectional, non-directional, complex, simple, null. Can anyone guess about the best option? As we can see that it is showing the direction, and it is showing that the adding of fluoride to the water is decreasing the number of dental visits, and that is, it is showing the direction. So A is the best option, that is unidirectional hypothesis. MCQ number 2. A pharmaceutical company A pharmaceutical company claims that their new drug is effective in treating headaches. They conduct a study in which they give the drug to 100 people with headaches and find that 75 of them report a significant improvement in their symptoms. The company wants to test the hypothesis the drug is effective in treating headaches. Which of the following is correct null hypothesis? The drug is not effective in treating headaches. The drug is effective in treating headaches. The drug increases the frequency of headaches. The drug is equally effective as a placebo in treating headaches. The drug is more effective than a placebo in treating headaches. So which one is the best option?
A.
Yes, A
Alpha.
is the right option. Yes. MCQ number 3. When a researcher rejects a true null hypothesis in his study and accepts the alternate hypothesis, what type of error is likely? Type 1, type 2, both type 1 and type 2, neither type 1 nor type 2. A very easy
A.
MCQ.
Alpha.
Yes, A is the right option. MCQ number 4. A test for a serious but curable disease similar to hypothesis testing with a null hypothesis of no disease and alternative hypothesis of disease. If the null hypothesis is rejected, treatment will be given. Otherwise, it will not. Assuming that treatment does not have serious side effects in the scenario, is better to increase the probability of making a type 1 error, providing treatment when it is not needed, making a type 1 error, not providing treatment when it is needed, making a type 2 error, providing treatment when it is not needed, making a type 2 error, not providing treatment when it is needed. Any
B.
guess? Alpha A is the right option. That is, he is making a type 1 error. MCQ number 5. Children can learn a second language faster before the age of 7. Is this statement a non-scientific statement, unidirectional hypothesis, non-directional hypothesis, null hypothesis, or complex hypothesis? Again, any guess? Okay, again, it is showing the
A.
direction.
Universal.
B is the right option.
B. B.
Yes, B is the right option. MCQ number 6. If my experimental hypothesis were eating cheese before bed affects the number of nightmares you have, what would the null hypothesis be? Eating cheese before bed gives you more nightmares. Eating cheese before bed gives you fewer nightmares. Eating cheese is linearly related to the number of nightmares you have. The number of nightmares you have is not affected by eating cheese before bed. Eating cheese and chocolate before bed affects the number of nightmares and the number of hours you sleep.
D.
Yes, D is the right option. MCQ number 7. Age and obesity increase your chances of getting diabetes and heart disease. Which hypothesis is best represented in this statement? Null hypothesis, alternate hypothesis, simple, non-directional, or complex hypothesis?
B.
Since we are dealing with the multiple variables, matlab two independent variables and two dependent variables, so this is complex hypothesis because it deals with the relationship between among multiple variables. MCQ number 8. Number of distinctions in a class are 2%. A researcher claims that the distinctions are less than 2%. Which of the following is the most appropriate option? Null hypothesis, complex hypothesis, unidirectional hypothesis, non-directional hypothesis, logical hypothesis. Any guess?
C.
Yes, C is the right option. MCQ number 9. Type 2 error, also known as false negative hypothesis testing, is acceptance of the null hypothesis when it is false and should be rejected, rejection of null hypothesis when it is true and should be accepted, rejection of the null hypothesis when it is false and should be rejected, acceptance of the null hypothesis when it is true and should be accepted.
Alpha.
Yes,
A.
yes, A is the right option. MCQ number 10. A power of test is the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when it is false. It is denoted by beta, alpha, 1 minus alpha, 1 minus beta.
Delta.
Yes, D is the right option. This is the key of MCQs. This is the YouTube link of presentation, and thank you.